Hello there, so here we are at the final installment, not only of the Powers of Death series, but also of the entire series that I've been producing that addresses these primary powers of life and death. And so far I've talked about the symbolic context that underpins burial rites, and we've also looked at the practice of ceremonial death masks. And so now for the very final installment, I want to look at a very striking example of ritual activity that's been practiced sporadically by various human groups, and speaks to this enduring symbolism of using the human body as an organic symbol in their ritual process. And this is the extreme phenomenon of self-mummification. So before I actually go on about talking about the practice directly, I first want to contextualize that by saying some very important things about the death state and why it's so psychologically prominent to us. Death represents an endpoint for us organically. We have been exposed to the realities of dying and watching people around us die, and of course we've seen the after-the-matter consequences of death, such as decomposition and such of the like. But most of all, death signifies to the living the impermanence of their experiences, the inescapable reality that no matter how immortal that we might feel while we're younger, the impermanence of our flesh is inescapable. And even while sometimes we might feel as though we're so distracted and out of time, as it were, we're always very much in time, and we're conjoined to the realities of being a living creature. And when we come face to face with death, usually of somebody that we used to know, it shocks us out of that existential complacency, and we are reminded of the realities of our mortal existence in a very visceral and very direct way. And as I've said in these videos many times before, anything of significance to the mind must be symbolically communicated, because symbolic communication is a means for the mind to retranslate and reconcile with complexity. So by designing symbols around our lives, even when they speak to the extinguishing of life itself, they are there because the brain wants them to be there, and they play a very important part in our psychological regulation. But there's something else here that we're not tapping into, and that's something quite peculiar to human beings. It's something that surrounds us everywhere, whether it's in mythological accounts or in escapist media such as movies or fantasy novels or video games. And because we're so saturated by its presence in the culture, we take its significance totally for granted. And that is the ability of an organism to form a conception of an alternative reality to the one that it finds itself in. The ability of an organism to form a conception of an alternative reality to the one that it finds itself in. Have you ever considered the foundational significance of that? Whether you've come to believe that such a thing is true personally is totally besides the point. The very fact that an organism has evolved with the capacity to simulate a kind of conception and consider it under complex conditions is no small point. And I think that this ability to interiorize our sensory experience and extrapolate it off into alternative models, such as conceptions of an afterlife per se, are prominent signifiers of our organism. And this ability is what underlies the practice of ceremonial burial, and it's also what underlies the practice of creating death masks. If we didn't possess the ability to conceive of an alternative existence, then why would we go to the effort to include items of import along with the bodies of individuals which are no longer animated and alive, and with the implied suggestion that these people who are now deceased might need them again? Why would we go to the effort if the ability to conceive of an alternative reality space was not available to us, we wouldn't. We'd simply recognize the practical measures for sanitation, perhaps, and simply bury the body in the ground undecorated, unceremoniously. We wouldn't go to any additional length to accessorize or ritualize or formalize the process in a particular way, even if we still had affectionate feelings for the deceased. Because when you think about it, if you're living in a primitive society and living under very difficult conditions, you need all of the resources that you can take. And anything that can be used will be used, unless we're talking about an alternative context around the process, which, as we've said here, is symbolically united to the psychological prominence around the death state and the unique ability of human beings to conceive of the idea that the deceased has not perished absolutely, but now exists in an alternative living space to this one. And this is really the primordial notion that still permeates through the intelligence of millions of minds to this day. The idea that existence does not merely begin and end in this life, but extends into alternative spaces, and that conception is facilitated by the unique human ability to introspect and to create simulations of alternative realms of existence. This primordial notion of an alternative living space travels throughout time and culture, and it's developed and expanded upon by various minds throughout the ages. The important thing to recognize is that this is truly an archaic idea, and its persistence into the modern world is guaranteed by the psychological impact of our experience and our ability to introspect and abstract into alternative possibilities. So I know that this might be quite a lot to take in at the beginning, but I really wanted to go in depth and talk about the underlying context before we unpack the religious practice of self-mummification itself, because I think that if we don't understand the underlying context behind these acts, then we fall foul of our rationalist devices and might simply dismiss them on the basis that they feel irrational and obtuse to our modern sensibilities. And one of the things that I really want to do with this project is continually remind people that this modern pretension that we have doesn't conform to the reality of things, because we still carry over all of the same fundamental prerequisites and psychological drives that informed our primitive ancestor. We are, in many ways, still very archaic creatures because we carry these same proclivities over from a bygone age, and they stack underneath all of the modern proclivities. So even though we might think that we've escaped the past, in much deeper ways of looking at things, we really haven't, because the past lives on through us as a prerequisite of our human organism. And like I've said, the continuance of this conception of an afterlife has taken many different forms throughout history. But what I find the most interesting are these systems that treat death as an opportunity for transcendence. In these systems, death is not merely the bridge between our world and the hereafter. It is the very juncture that informs our direction into our afterlife metamorphosis, and that informs the quality of the conditions that we experience in this simulated idea of an afterlife. And we have a conception of that in the Christian model, just to select one that might be a bit more familiar to us, because in the Christian system we still have this primordial notion of an alternative existence, but the conditions of that existence are dependent upon the value of the actions that we have willed into existence while we've been alive. And this is then separated across a tripartite system. So if the value of our actions amount to a value positive, then we upscale to a higher state of existence. Likewise, if the sum of our actions convert to a value negative, then we cascade into an alternative state of existence that's much more unpleasant. And there's also this kind of transitory limbo state in between. So we can see here how the primordial notion has been expanded and territorialized into exclusive chambers that correspond to the morality system that the religious system uses to modulate human behavior. Yet still, this expanded concept of death acting as a gateway to another stage of life is still here. And that's really what I want to focus on in this exercise. So then, let's talk now directly about this phenomenon of self-mummification. First of all, let's lay out an outline of it, as it's important to get the basics right before we expand upon anything else. This is a Buddhist practice that has been focused around the regions of East Asia, mainly in countries like Japan and Tibet, and also India, actually. And categorically, this would be considered part of a family of religious action that we would call asceticism. So a component that comes along with many religious systems is this affirmation in the powers of self-mastery, usually within the directive that by bringing one's impulsive nature under the command of the will, not only does an individual elevate one's physical and mental well-being, but also the quality of one's own spiritual worth is refined to a higher standard, and that plays into the order of the religious cosmological system. Like we see in Christianity, as in Buddhism, there is a cosmological system and a system of action, and the task of life is to try and harmonize the positives of the cosmological system with the system of action so that we can live in accordance with an idealized life code and eventually conclude towards an idealized destination in death. So it informs part of a practice of self-development, and that operates within a hierarchical system of actions that attempts to scale upwards towards an idealized destination. Specifically, asceticism is where an individual willingly undertakes a regimen of severe abstinence from actions that correspond to sensual indulgence. So that's abstinence from things like alcohol and sexual activity. Certain foods such as meats can be forbidden, or any other practice that concludes towards an indulgent end. These are considered within the idealized system as being corruptive influences and therefore have to be mitigated or absolved of entirely. So it's a lot more than fasting on Ramadan or trying to curb one's sexual impulses in a nightclub. But nonetheless, asceticism still belongs to that same order of action within the religious systems that speak towards the goals of self-mastery. And what I want to do is focus on the Japanese variant of this practice of asceticism as it pertains to self-mummification. And the Japanese variant is called Soko Shinbutsu. I think I've got that right, and that corresponds to something like becoming Buddha in the body. And this practice, it's believed, derives from as early as the 11th century. And it comes from certain sects that used to live in the mountain regions of Japan. And that sect specialized in a very austere form of asceticism. And this style of asceticism sought to emulate the life of a monk whose name was Kukai. And there's a story behind this monk. Kukai, as you might imagine, was an ascetic, and he devised a system of ascetic practice that was as incredible as it was extreme. And before his unusual death, he founded the esoteric Shingon school of Buddhism that specialized in the technique that he created. It's said that before his death, Kukai went up to a mountain cave, and in this cave were these carved out tombs where the monks went to die, a bit like an elephant's graveyard kind of scenario. And he went into a state of meditation so extreme that he was able to incarnate Buddha within his own body, and this preserved him in this state of kind of suspended animation, mummification essentially. And the story has it that it has this prophetic aspect to it as well, because as a salvational continuation of the process, it was said that Kukai would one day return in the form of a divine being and usher a huge number of souls towards nirvana. So it has almost like this salvational, Christ-like aspect to it as well. And it's this story of the monk, who's a real person, it isn't just made up. This is what actually founded the practice of self-mummification, in the Japanese variant of it, that is. And the way that these monks would achieve this process of self-mummification is absolutely incredible. What they would do is go out into the mountains and isolate themselves away from other people. And they would find a secluded place, probably in some kind of forest or a cave system or something where they could be, reasonably shielded from the elements. And they would spend most of their time meditating and chanting mantras. But to kind of bring on this process of self-mummification, they had to do some really extreme things to their diet. And so what they would do is they wouldn't hunt or anything like that. They wouldn't eat any meat. They would eat only the bark of the wood, the trees in the wood. They would just eat the bark off the trees. They would also eat acorns and seeds that they could find in the forest. And there is an intent behind this thing. What these things do is that they bring the body fat right down, and they complement this by gradually reducing their water intake. So they're just shriveling all of the body fat down, and they're slowly dehydrating the body. And they would do this over a very, very long period of time. And what this would do is it would deprive the body's internal ecosystem of bacteria and parasites from the resources that they need to survive as well. And this is really important to understand, because these bacteria and parasites actually aid in the process of decomposition after we die. So they're just bringing the body fat down, they're dehydrating the body, they're doing all of this meditation, and they're doing all of these mantras, and they're doing this over it is very slow and gradual space of time. They would prepare something like 3 years for it, in actually trying to condition the body, and that's just to get started, because this process of mummification, it didn't happen in a week or two. They would be doing this up to 10 years after the 3-year period. So this is an incredibly agonizingly slow and arduous process in this process of self-mummification. And if successful, this procedure would leave the corpse in such a state that at the point of death, the body couldn't rot. And so it would be kind of preserved there as a mummified object. And monks would come and, check on them every, a few years or so to, check on their progress to see if they'd just, died, because a lot of them did. The success rate, actually, of these people being able to actually achieve this was very, very low. Most of the monks didn't actually be able to achieve it. They just kind of starved to death and rotted away, or some of the monks just couldn't find them because they couldn't find where they'd actually gone to hide or anything like that. But in the Japanese case that we're looking at here, there are over 20 successful self-mummifications that have been achieved in the Japanese system alone. The system is actually now illegal to practice. The monks over there don't do it anymore. But there has been a resurgence of interest in these self-mummified corpses, since a re-evaluation of their significance to anthropology has at least been introduced. So that's the bare details of the system as it is. It's quite extreme, isn't it? And so What are we actually looking at in this system? Well, we've already kind of gone over it, haven't we? In essence, there's a disciplinarian system of self-development, and that's tapping into a cosmological system that gravitates to an amplified state of existence that opens up only after the juncture of death. And what I also think that's really significant here is how the body becomes a symbolic subject at the point of the death state. The preserved bodies of these monks symbolizes a crystallization of the idealized religious state. They've almost become corpse icons, for want of a better way of putting it. The body was once the vessel of a living creature, and now, in its new metamorphosis, has eclipsed that life and become a subject of significance within the religious system. And I think that when we hear about systems like this, we have to also bear in mind the psychological impact that extreme rites of self-sacrifice have over the psyche. Acts of self-sacrifice have an almost possessive sway over the psyche, because the emotional impact of the death state is compounded by the fact that this organism chose its fate at great expense to its own comfort, no less. And there's an endearing aspect that a lot of human beings usually universally respond to in things like this. Not only does it communicate the realities of our own mortality back to us, it subtly speaks to our own unwillingness to face up to the realities of death within our own existence. Because these people would not be able to achieve what they had achieved if it were not for the fact that on some level they had made peace with the reality that they were going to die. And no matter the expenses of comfort or pain on their part, that was completely acceptable. What I have wanted to convey in these series is that the human organism is in a dynamic conversation with the complexities of its existence. And in order to make sense of it all, we necessitate a dynamic style of communication to translate that conversation into a language that can afford us both clarity and closure over our experiences. The consequences of this conversation inform the corpus of our human cultural record that acts as the representation and retransmitter of all human signals. And one of the most prominent forms of clarity and closure that we require is over the realities of life and death. The psychological impact of life and death is so profoundly felt within the human system that it must be continually retranslated into new media and practices that aid us in the process to find the reconciliation that we need to make our perpetuation as a species possible. These artifacts are not mere trinkets of indulgence or objects of intrigue, but are the embodiments of our very nature, and each in their own way communicate a translation of what it means to be human. If scientists discovered a species of insect that had developed the ability to retranslate its experiences into an alternative representational form, then the academics would never shut up about it. But when it comes to the human creature, we take this ability deeply for granted. We have become so normalized to the presence of these phenomena that we have forgotten their universal message, that we are the translators of nature's signals, a conversation between the cosmos and itself, reverberating throughout the organic instruments of a symphony called mankind. Powers of life and powers of death are the two major harmonies that inform the composition of this symphony. And the reason that they reveal themselves so frequently is because all other styles of human expression are informed by their influence. They are universal and omnipotent in their influence, because all action is united to the realities of life and the consequences of death. These two subjects form the bedrock of our symbolic expression as a species group, and I trust that this series has contributed in some measure to complement the gifts of clarity and closure that they bestow.